Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Keep Up with the Changing Nature of Spend Inside and Outside the Office. My name is Emily, and I work at Lola.com, one of the sponsors of today's webinar. This webinar is also being sponsored by TeamPay, and we're very excited to have two amazing speakers on the line today, who will introduce themselves in just a moment. Before we begin, I just want to let everyone know that the webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a copy of the recording within 24 hours. And we'll save time for questions at the end, so please submit your questions as we go. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it over to our two speakers to introduce themselves. Andrew, why don't you kick us off?
Sure, thanks so much, Emily. So my name is Andrew Hogan. I'm the founder of CEO of TeamPay. We're a venture-backed software company that's transforming the mid-market B2B purchasing process. Originally, I started my career as an engineer and learned government procurement kind of firsthand at NASA, and then became a serial entrepreneur selling my previous company, UrbanTag, in 2012. I started TeamPay because I'm passionate about helping companies operate more efficiently and was able to apply some of the knowledge I had in other areas into a finance department that has not really had good tools over the last couple of decades, and we're really excited about today's webinar. Thanks so much.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Morrison, the VP of Finance and Operations at Lola.com. I joined Lola at the beginning of the year, but prior to this, I was the VP of Finance and Operations at Modaxo, where I oversaw all back office operations, including finance, operations, HR, and admin. Prior to that, I've held various finance and operations positions throughout my career, most notably at HubSpot and EMC.
All right, thanks, Andrew and Rebecca. So today we're going to talk about a lot of different things. We're going to start off with talking about how the nature of spend is changing. So Andrew, what do you think is the biggest change you've seen around how companies are spending money?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways that you can describe it or think about it, but what it all comes down to is just simply more employees are making purchases. As I mentioned, I started my career in the government, and we had a procurement team that was responsible for controlling and managing all the spend across the organization. And it would have been inconceivable for me to show up one day and say, hey, here's this great software tool I found online, and I want to use it for my work. I would have probably gotten fired at that point. And so what we've seen is, you can call it the rise of bottoms-up, product-led growth. There's all these initiatives where employees at the edge of the organization are getting more involved in the decisions around their day-to-day work, more autonomy and empowerment, but also what that means is more decisions around spending money. And this has become really difficult to maintain in a world that is not adapted, particularly in the finance department, to this distributed spend problem.
Absolutely. And Rebecca, what do you want to add to that?
I've also noticed that employees are spending money on different types of vendors, and they actually want to use their preferred vendors. So an example of this might be they actually want to use their own Amazon account to buy office supplies, or they want to use Grubhub or Seamless to order their food. We're also seeing a lot more travel across multiple departments, whereas before it used to just mainly be sales.
Okay, so let's dive into the types of purchases you're seeing. Andrew, what are the most common purchases you see with your customers at TeamPay?
Yeah, it's been really interesting because we see kind of a broad base of spend patterns. Obviously, as Lola recognizes, most of your travel now is purchased online, especially the big ticket items. So that's a huge chunk of what our customers spend money on. Other things that we've seen include, the typical software and SaaS subscriptions, right? So that's something that's extremely common when you have employees that are signing up for a $15 a month buffer subscription or something like that. But also, the rise of on-demand and fractional services, right? Today you have Envoy, which is effectively your receptionist, and that's a on-demand service that kind of sits at the front, and it's a subscription. You have on-demand catering with Caviar and Seamless and tools like that. And then you have, transportation and fractional conference rooms with Breather and all of these things. And all of this stuff just adds up, right? So there's a lot of categories of operating expense now that is no longer simply meals and entertainment, and also is beyond rent and salaries. And we've just seen an explosion in terms of the diversity of what companies are spending money on.
Yeah, and you mentioned travel. So Rebecca, can you dive a little bit more into how travel spend is working?
Thanks. So T&E is pretty much like one of the highest spends right after compensation and benefits. And so not only is travel really expensive, but it's also a personal purchase, even if it's just for a business trip, because people have preferences on what airlines they want to fly, and what hotels they want to stay at. And then it gets a little bit complex when you add in loyalty programs and rewards. And then when you're traveling, you also need to think about how they're purchasing meals, and they also taxis, Ubers, Wi-Fi, and a ton of other things. And then keeping up with all that spend and also allowing employees to book their preferences are some of the biggest issues that we hear about at Lola.
So we also know that employees are a lot more distributed now than they used to be with remote working. So Andrew, can you talk a little bit about how location factors into all this spend?
Yeah, I mean, it's something we definitely see as a trend across our customer base, right? We see more companies with not only remote offices, right? So maybe a satellite office in a lower cost market, which I think has been around for a while, but teams that are almost 100% fully distributed. And I think that puts a lot of pressure on the traditional processes, which, required policy, required sharing resources. It's very difficult to walk over to your boss's cubicle if that cubicle is 500 miles away. And so that's really changed the nature of how companies deal with this. And I think that's put, additional pressure on finance, controllers, travel management, all those sorts of people when you have people all over the place that need to spend money, and how do you actually manage and control that centrally?
We're noticing it's pretty similar with travel. You have some employees, like as Andrew talked about, that work remotely and they need to travel into the office a couple times a year. They need to know how they should book according to their guidelines.
So with all of these distributed employees and all of the changes in spend, that of course means more problems, especially for finance teams. So Andrew, what do you see as the biggest problem that finance teams are facing?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, right? And I think as anyone will tell you, especially a controller, spending money actually isn't that difficult. The problems that arise are what happens before and after the money is spent, right? And so, frequently we see budget and policy misalignment, right? Which I know that that Rebecca's run into with their employees and their customers at Lola, and that includes visibility around what is being spent, and is that within budget? Is that within policy? Where are you tracking for the month? We see a lot of concerns around what we think of as runaway spend. So you sign up for a service and all of a sudden that service doubles or triples in cost. And finance gets caught kind of behind that and trying to figure it out, or what we think of as zombie subscriptions, right? So these are things that people have signed up for. They put it on someone's card, they put it on their own card, their own corporate card, and they forget about it. And, this results in a lot of waste across the organization, especially when you compound this across larger teams. And then on top of that, there's getting the information to the right people. So oftentimes the manager and the employee will have a conversation, but getting that information back over to finance creates a lot of problems. And so there's a data problem. And the finance team often does what we kind of think of as best guess accounting, right? So they're trying to figure out, okay, what is this thing? And I have two charges from Amazon, and one is my food and one is my office supplies, and how do I tell them apart? And so this not only impacts the finance team, but it impacts the entire workforce, because now you're putting more bureaucratic processes on the team, and finance needs to get control over that. They need to have the books in a clean state. And so now you're trying to recruit a bunch of people to do this additional work. And we just find that this is something that is really ripe for disruption.
Yeah, you made a lot of good points there, and I feel like I've seen a lot of things like that happening at Lola, so I know Rebecca has some good information to add here.
We're also noticing that there's an issue with fairness across the company. When there's no budget guideline or policy, employees are often left to guess how they're supposed to spend. Not only does it likely result in the company being over budget, but you've got some employees that are booking expensive things like 5-star hotels, and others are pinching every penny. This is both bad for finance and the employee morale.
Yeah, we kind of have this belief that employees are good actors and they just want to do the right thing. And I think one of the important things that, using software and tools can help is just simply aligning expectations.
Yeah, definitely. And all of that and all of the problems that you just talked about kind of lead to one big issue, which is around awkward conversations. So nobody really wants to talk about money. So luckily, Andrew and Rebecca have a couple of tips on how to deal with that kind of a thing. So Rebecca, why don't you kick us off and give us some of your advice?
So If you've noticed some people that are spending incorrectly, I think there's a couple tips we have on how you would give some feedback. So I think the first thing is you should always address the problem in real time. Don't let these issues fester. I think it's also really important to explain the why behind the rules. When people actually understand why something is in place, they're much more likely to follow the rule. And then we also find that getting managers involved for repeat offenders is incredibly helpful. It's much easier if you've gotten them involved in monitoring their team spend, and that way finance doesn't always have to be the bad cop. Now, if you actually want to try and get ahead of these conversations in general, we would suggest that you involve employees in creating policies that are frequent users of something. For example, you should talk to your frequent travelers about their preferences and incorporate some of those into the policy. Finding the balance between what's best for the company and what's best for your employee experience is really key. Then it's important to go over the guidelines and rules with each team to ensure people understand what is being asked of them.
That's great. That's great advice. Andrew, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Rebecca hit on the main points there. I just can't overemphasize the real-time nature of this, right? And, typically in a lot of companies, what we see is if they're using like an expense management system to deal with employee spend across the company, they wait until they get a corporate card statement. And then at some point they have to wait until the employee submits it. And it's probably 6 weeks before even a conversation happens about, hey, maybe this was out of policy or this was out of spec. And I think that makes those conversations even more difficult because it's so far in the rearview mirror. And similarly, by using an approval process and setting up good policies and good structure in the front of it, you actually set expectations and you can avoid some of those awkward conversations, right? So I think the timeliness of this is really important. And then, still allowing your employees to feel empowered and having some empathy for what they're trying to do and really creating a conversation about it, as Rebecca was alluding to, I think is most important.
Yeah, you guys both made some really good points, and I would just add, as someone who isn't in finance but does make a lot of purchases, when I can do something with a policy and I don't have to ask permission and I'm just allowed to buy something and I know that I'm doing the right thing for the company, like that's really empowering. It feels really good to just be able to do something on your own and not have to bug anyone. So a good example is using Lola, just because I travel a lot for Lola, but seeing what's in guidelines, like that makes everything so much easier, and it just takes time away from finance when they have to keep replying to people's emails, letting them know if they're allowed to do something. Okay, so speaking of good tools, let's talk a little bit more about the tools that you guys are using. So both Rebecca and Andrew are part of companies who are creating smart tech solutions to a lot of the problems that they address. So Andrew, what are some of the biggest issues with the current tech out there? I know you talked about some of it. Can you dive a little bit deeper into why this market is so good to start getting into and what some of the changes are happening?
Yeah, so I mean, look, I think, fundamentally we believe that employees and companies are going to be spending more money, not less, going forward, right? And the nature of that has changed, as we described previously, with more and more of this happening bottoms up and more of it is distributed across more and more vendors. So all of that complexity is really creating a lot of problems, and yet most of the tools that finance has are, 1, if not 2 decades old, right? Ranging from procurement systems to kind of traditional expense management systems. And really, to be honest, the big innovation there has, instead of pasting receipts like I used to do or gluing them to a piece of paper, I get to take a picture on my phone. And this is really an incremental improvement, but it's not really a process improvement. It doesn't save me much time other than putting some stickies and playing arts and crafts at the end of the month, which actually I enjoyed in some strange way. And so, we're finding that finance tools are still using these same old tools to manage new behaviors, and it's just not working, right? And so playing credit card frisbee creates a whole bunch of work on the back end when you're trying to untangle the mess. And, as I think about, try to decide who ordered the extra side of fries at the end of the month, and that extra side of fries could be a significant amount when you multiply that across lots of people at the company. So this slows down closing the books. It creates a lot of extra overhead for the employees. It's prone to human error because now you have humans doing a lot of data work, which frankly software is much better at. And so, we really just see there's a huge opportunity there to use technology to help solve the data problem, to enforce the policies, to provide better visibility, and ultimately allow employees to feel more in control and self-service. And that's really where we see the opportunity going forward around distributed spend.
Great, and I know Rebecca has some opinions here, being on the other side of getting a message from Rebecca asking what a purchase was for. So Rebecca, why don't you jump in with your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think a lot of what Andrew talked about is the life that I live right now. So, and then specific to travel, if companies don't actually have any travel policies or guidelines in places, it brings us back to the issue of fairness across the company. So if you have to tell someone, say your policy is to just use best judgment, but you don't actually know what that means to each individual. You could actually have someone staying at the Ritz, but then you've got someone pinching pennies staying at Motel 6, right? So without the policy, there's nothing for employees to follow, and they don't actually feel confident during that booking process, which Emily kind of alluded to before. There's also no way for the finance team to know what's being spent until after the trip happens. Then on the other side of the spectrum, you could have some companies that have a super strict policy where employees have to read 25-page document and search all over the internet to actually find something that falls within their policy. It wastes a lot of time and leaves the employees frustrated to the point that they disregard the policy altogether, which is completely the opposite of the point.
So that's a lot about the problems that people are facing. So let's dive into how to solve those problems. So it's about finding a balance, and I think both of you kind of mentioned this a little bit, finding the balance between the company budget and the employee experience. So Andrew, why don't you kick this one off and talk a little bit about the importance of real-time visibility into spend?
Yeah, I think we hit on that earlier when we were talking about just avoiding some of those awkward conversations, right? And so, when you think about how do you start to manage spend at scale across a distributed organization and really handle that from a bottoms-up fashion, there's several factors that we think are really important to do that. One is that real-time visibility, which, as Rebecca mentioned, just helps avoid some of these other awkward conversations that can come into play 6 or 8 weeks later after it's already happened, and the toothpaste is out of the tube effectively. And related to that is, and some companies have different policies around this, and really allowing the company to choose how much approval and when is approval necessary, right? So we have customers that come in and say, okay, everything under $1,000 needs no approval, and everything from 1,000 to 10,000 can be approved at a director or a VP level, and anything over 10,000 needs to go to finance. And so really being able to configure that policy for the behavior of your organization is really important. And, part of that is giving you flexible guidelines around that so you can understand, okay, these different types of patterns and these people can have, different approaches and different policy to that. So we find all of that is really important. The automation part of this becomes really interesting too when you start to scale. And that's something that, our customers see time and time again. We had a customer who had a 90-page American Express statement every month that they were manually trying to reconcile. First off, figuring out who bought something on that 90-page Amex statement was difficult, and then even just going through and coding it and managing the data. And so as, all these other factors explode around bottoms-up spend and distributed teams, automation becomes more and more important to pull that together. But I think the last thing that I want to hit on is it's similar to, the camera analogy. The best camera is the one that's in your pocket, and the best spend management system is the one that people use. And so employee compliance and their willingness to use the system is actually the most important thing. And even if it means sacrificing a little bit of perfection around the controls or something like that, you always gain more by having employee participate at 100%. And I think access to that system is really important, whether it's on your phone, it could be in your Slack, it could be on the web, it could be in your browser, it could be in your email. Just having access to that system is really important. And the employee compliance piece of this is, I think, the thing that is required for any of this to be effective.
Definitely. And something that you mentioned there, and Rebecca's also mentioned, is around this control, the policies, the guidelines. And something that we see at Lola is sometimes those kinds of words can be a little scary to, smaller companies and startups who don't want to seem too corporate or seem like they have too much control. So, Rebecca, what can companies do to gain some control but still provide that flexibility?
Yeah, so this is where I actually think flexible guidelines are super important. So an example of this would be like in your travel policy, you can set spend guidelines for hotels based on the city the employee is staying in and not just set one cap across all hotel bookings. So we call this dynamic pricing, and it's something that we actually offer on the Lola platform. So an example of this would be, say we know that a hotel in Boston should cost about $350 a night. That would get them a good quality hotel. They could still be in the city, close to meetings. In Lola, you would set this guideline and then just apply the same logic across major cities based on that. So if the same type of hotel in Atlanta might only cost $150, and that allows you, so your employees are now only booking $150 in Atlanta and not actually spending $350. Another thing that can help maintain your policy is to give access to the managers so they can see their team spend, and it really helps finance to keep, so there's more eyes actually paying attention to what's happening. And, I like it because it always doesn't make me be the bad guy. Let the managers help you is kind of one of our lessons that we've learned.
So kind of getting more eyes on the policy and on the spend makes it so that you're not the only one monitoring it, and it doesn't seem like there's so much control in just one person.
Totally.
Okay. All right, so we talked about a lot of things here, a lot of good information. So let's take a second to talk about a little more how software can help, and also what you should look for if you actually want to implement a software solution at your company. So Andrew, why don't you start this one?
Yeah, and so I think, what's really important here is you find something that aligns with the business needs first, right? And this seems obvious, but the business needs are more than just the buyer's needs or the finance needs, right? So understanding what the team needs are, how it works out at the edges of your organization, and understand the behavior that's happening there, right? Are the managers working with their employees to decide how to spend the budget? What is that kind of internal, tribal knowledge that happens within those teams, and how do you translate that into requirements, I think is really important. And are there exceptions to that, and how do you deal with those exceptions, right? And all of this is in the goal of trying to make the rollout as frictionless as possible, right? So turning something that typically is a chore, right, we think of it as the work of work, and reducing the amount of work, right, that goes into that. So turning something into a chore to something that is fairly frictionless and effortless, right? When I started my career and I wanted to share a file, I had to put up a SharePoint link. I had to get a VPN token. I had to get someone to log in. It was all of this work. Or sometimes I would just drop, a CD-ROM in a folder and send it off to someone. And now we have these amazing tools like Dropbox and Box that allow you to collaborate. And so, reducing the friction for your team actually drives much better productivity and ultimately drives more happiness amongst your team because they feel more empowered. And I think that part of it becomes really important, especially in today's world where most people have grown up with technology that's very consumer facing, and they want their enterprise tools to have the same personality and ease of use.
I love that. Make enterprise tools work like consumer-based tools. That's awesome. Okay, so Rebecca, did you want to add anything to this one?
Yeah, I think actually being integrated into tools that your team is already using is huge. The easier you can make things, the better it is for your entire team. I also think that things that work for the company, but also might be a perk for your employees, right? So an example, in travel, we always recommend that you let your employees keep their loyalty points that they earn on flight and hotel bookings so they can actually use it in their personal lives. It doesn't cost the company any extra money, but it adds so much value to the employee. Make sure that you're looking for software that have features that make it easier to wow your employees. That's our advice here.
Great. Okay, so we've actually had a bunch of questions come in. So we've come to the Q&A portion. So Andrew, I'm going to send this first question over to you. How do you get buy-in from senior executives about financial policies and tools?
Yeah, so I think, there's several key strategic factors that we see for the senior executives, like the CFOs that we work with. Probably the top line one that we run into is just simply headcount reduction. And if you have a bad process or a manual process, you simply just need more people to enforce that process and monitor it. And so every step you can take out of any sort of expensing process or reconciliation process or coding, any step you can take out of that saves you direct headcount in the finance team. But secondarily, what comes along with that is oftentimes companies use their highest valued employees, their operating executives, in roles they're not built for, right? You're turning your VP of marketing into a controller who's now responsible for tracking down and coding all of the spend that their team is doing, or you have to hire someone in finance to do that. So I think that's kind of the top level here is like, look, this is a direct ROI in terms of the number of headcount that you can save by putting in better tools and better systems. And then there's the secondary effects around actually capping the spend and getting good expectations in place, right? So don't stay at the Ritz-Carlton when you go to San Francisco, stay at the Marriott or the Hilton. That's within the policy. And how do you do that? And what's interesting is there's a lot of movement that we've seen around employee satisfaction, employee engagement, and those kinds of things. And all of this tends to stem from, making employees feel more empowered, having to do less bureaucratic work. And ultimately, when you roll out a good process that the employees love and that makes finance happy, you end up with this kind of virtuous cycle of like happier employees and more productive work and more employees, easier recruiting and all those kinds of things. So, ultimately it comes down to employee satisfaction and employee happiness metric, which we know a lot of executives are looking at because talent is so difficult to acquire and retain.
That's really great advice. Thanks, Andrew. Okay, so our next question, I'm going to give this one to Rebecca. What size does the company have to be in order to start to make more formal policies?
Yeah, Andrew, I'd love to hear your take on this one, but I think it really kind of depends on how much travel a company has or how much decentralized spending is going on. But I think if you want to come up with like a hard and fast number, I'd probably say it would sit somewhere around 50. But I think, what we talked about, you can have pretty flexible guidelines and you don't have to have such rigid policies. But that's just kind of my general take. Andrew, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, we find it right around that 50 to 60 number as well. And I think the reason that seems to be the magic number is typically when you start to spend real dollars, but it's also the point in an organization where you have multiple levels of hierarchy. Below 50 people, you typically have your leaders or your managers and you have their reports. And all of a sudden you have middle management starting to appear in that 50 to 100 band. And that's also the time when you start to professionalize finance. So most companies hire their first VP or in-house finance person right around that 50 or 60 person range. They're probably going through an audit for the first time. And now you've got a bunch of middle managers in the middle. And all of that just creates the need to put a little more structure around things. We prefer to talk about discipline as opposed to process, right? So just giving companies a little more discipline and setting expectations, but that typically happens around that stage because of those other factors that come into play.
Great, thanks. Okay, the next question, which Andrew, I'm going to give this one to you. How do you differentiate between general business expenses versus employee expenses?
Employee expenses, meaning employee expenses that are specific to that individual person?
I think so, yeah. I think it means business expenses for the company versus like an employee-specific expense that they need for maybe their job or their department.
Yeah, so, it's a bit of a continuum that we see. Business expenses and kind of, we think of it as operating expenses. So we think of it in two categories, right? So is this purchase attached to the company, right? Am I buying a log monitoring tool that's part of engineering and this purchase is attached to the company? Or is this something that is attached to me, like my personal GitHub subscription, right? And so, we think it's actually important for the finance team, especially to understand upfront, is this an operating expense that's part of the company's books and this should survive if this person leaves? Or is this something that if the person leaves, it goes with them? And, our customers use the pre-approval and the coding up front that we provide to be able to separate into those two categories, because that also affects a lot of the modeling and FP&A activities that you do.
All right, thanks so much. Okay, so the next one I'm going to give to Rebecca. I love this question. How do I get employees excited about changing processes and ensure employee compliance?
Big topic over at Lola. So I would say one big thing to ensure compliance is involving those frequent spenders at the beginning when you're actually trying to set that policy and guideline. And I think I talked about that a little bit earlier. And then really trust always to explain the why. I think they'll embrace the policy more if they actually understand why you're setting it. In terms of actually how you make it exciting, we've done lunch and learns or those kind of things. You could make a game out of it. I don't know, but I think just trying to make it a little bit lighthearted and less doom and gloom, which I think sometimes is associated with finance, but that's kind of some of the success that we've had.
Andrew, anything you'd add to that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think, gamifying it, making it a little more interesting. And look, what we found is compared to, as Rebecca mentioned, getting a 25-page policy in a handbook and then logging in and using a tool like Lola, you're automatically making people happy when you're giving them something that allows them to do their job. And our belief, again, is just that employees just want to get their work done and they want to do it with as little BS and friction as possible. And so by empowering the employees, we haven't had really any problems at all with getting them excited about changing the process because they're so underwater and they're so tired of dealing with 20-year-old tools or written policies that they received when they signed up and they got the employee handbook and then they don't never get refreshed 2 years later and they have to go track down. And all of that is a horrible experience for your employees. So there's just a lot of low-hanging fruit here.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next question I think is more to you, Andrew. Is there still a place for traditional corporate cards in the purchasing process? What about if you're buying dinner or something in person?
Yeah, so we think of this, across a continuum, right? And at the end of the day, absolutely, right? Corporate cards are not going away. It is one of the best tools for empowering your team to go out and do what they need to do, right? And so, at the very kind of like early end of the spectrum or the smaller end of the spectrum, you have employees who actually don't need a corporate card, right? And they don't need to go out and spend money all the time, but they have these ad hoc purchases. And so TeamPay provides virtual cards, and there's other like loaner cards that we offer and purchasing cards that we offer that can kind of supply for that, right? At the other end of the spectrum, you may have your VP of engineering or your VP of sales. And, basically in most companies I've worked in, as long as the VP of sales is hitting their number, they can spend whatever they want. And so, that's at the other end of the spectrum, and you're working on a forgiveness model. And that also requires things like real-time visibility to make sure and watch out for fraud. It requires automation around the data part of it. And frankly, there's just a lot of friction you can reduce out of that process as well. So imagine a world where an executive swipes their card, it's within the parameters for that limit or within the parameters for that trip or visit or customer or whatever. They get prompted on their phone, they take a picture of the receipt at the restaurant, they leave the receipt in the bill, and they walk home and everything is finished and they don't have to do another step. That is the world that we can offer on the corporate card side, and there's absolutely still a world for that. So I think it's completely a continuum, and I think that won't change over time because there's so much convenience at the other end of the spectrum, and really companies just need the tools to make the decision themselves about when to apply which of those scenarios across that spectrum.
That's great, and that sounds like a really awesome process. So definitely that was a great answer. Thanks, Andrew. Sorry, we just got one other question that just came in. So this is asking about virtual payments. Is that something that TeamPay is offering right now?
Yeah, so we offer virtual payments both via single-use virtual cards as well as recurring use virtual cards. And actually we're about 50-50. So about 50% of our virtual payments are single use and 50% are recurring use. Virtual cards have been around for a long time, and typically they've been integrated into an accounts payable process with a purchasing card program and your ERP. And so we've kind of democratized that and brought that into the digital age and the software age. And that's a lot of what we do, but that's absolutely part of what we do. And you can use it for vendors, you can use it for merchants, you can use it for one-off vendors, paying invoices, those sorts of things. Absolutely.
Thanks. Okay, so this next question definitely is more geared towards Rebecca. What's the best way to organize travel spend reporting? Should you get more granular with flights, hotels, meals, or should you be more general?
So I think it really depends on what you're trying to solve for, but at the baseline, in your general ledger, you should have pretty granular, you should get pretty granular with your accounts, right? You should have an account for your flights, you should have an account for your lodging, something for taxi and other, then meals. And then you can have the flexibility if you want your reporting to be granular or more higher level. And then, like I said, it really depends on what you're trying to solve for. So an example would be, say you're trying to set next year's budget. I really like to think of that in the terms of trips. So if I know that our sales team is going to make 2 client visits per month, and each client visit I know is going to cost, say like $1,000. You've got 300 on flights, 300 on hotels, and then say 400 on everything else. I like to kind of get the granular level to help me model out at a much higher level. So it really, I think, ultimately depends on what you're trying to solve for.
Can I add something to that as well,
Absolutely.
Emily? I think one of the things that we see across our customers, in addition to what Rebecca was saying, is the cost accounting of that, right? So a flight for sales and a flight for engineering need to end up in different buckets. And so I think it's really important when you have a good tool in place, especially when it comes to budget time, to understand spend by department and other dimensions. It could be cost center, it could be customer. We have situations where, our customers are allocating some of their flights and their travel expenses back to some of their customers, right? You can imagine in the consulting world. So all of that cost allocation is part of that spend reporting that Rebecca was alluding to, and I think really important, especially as companies grow.
That's great. Thanks for adding that. Okay, so it looks like that was our last question. If anyone has anything else, they can throw it out right now. But first I want to say thanks to Andrew and Rebecca. If you look here, they've both included their email addresses, so if anybody has any follow-up questions, wants more information on TeamPay or Lola, please feel free to email them. And thanks again, both of you, for all of your knowledge and for being here today. And thanks for TeamPay for hosting this webinar with us. And I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That was hard.
Yeah.
Because I felt like I wanted to talk about his stuff, not Lola's stuff.
Yeah.
Well, because all the things he's talking about are like real life.